Once upon a time, in a quiet village surrounded by wide green fields, there lived a young boy named Ryan with his parents in a small house at the edge of town. At first glance, Ryan seemed like an ordinary village boy, but everyone knew one thing about him: he was extremely lazy. Every day, he went to the fields with his father, who worked tirelessly to grow rice for their family. Yet Ryan always looked for the easiest way to finish his tasks with the least possible effort. His only responsibility was to chase away birds that came to eat the rice crops, a job most boys handled by running around with sticks or... Ryan, however, disliked moving too much, so instead of chasing the birds himself, he used his head in an unusual way. He placed wooden poles across the field and tied ropes between them, allowing him to scare the birds simply by pulling the ropes while lying down and resting. From the outside, it looked clever, but in reality, it was driven by his desire to avoid hard work. His father noticed this habit and often worried silently, wondering what would happen if one day he became too weak to work. He feared that Ryan, who had never truly pushed himself, would not be able to manage the land or take responsibility for the family. Still, Ryan always completed his assigned work, and because the crops were protected, his father never scolded him. Time passed, and one harsh summer brought a long, dry season to the village. During this difficult period, Ryan's father fell seriously ill and was unable to go to the fields. Suddenly, all the responsibility fell on Ryan's shoulders. For the first time in his life, he had to manage everything on his own: watering the crops, protecting them, and maintaining the land. At first, he tried, but his body and mind were not used to such hard labor. Days turned into weeks, and without enough care and water, the rice plants slowly began to dry up. No matter how much Ryan tried, he could not save the crops alone. One night, overwhelmed and exhausted, he sat outside under the open sky, staring at the stars with a heavy heart. For the first time, he felt truly disappointed in himself. He realized that his laziness had left him unprepared for real challenges, and the weight of his family's future now felt unbearable. As regret filled his thoughts, Ryan silently wished he had tried harder before. Not just for himself, but for the people who depended on him. That night marked a turning point in Ryan's life, because as the sun rose the next morning, he heard unusual excitement spreading through the village. Curious and restless, he followed the voices and soon found a crowd gathered in the main square where a royal soldier was making an announcement. The soldier spoke loudly and clearly, declaring that the king was hosting a grand competition at the palace, and the winner would receive a chest filled with gold. For most villagers, it sounded like an impossible dream, but for Ryan, whose family crops were failing and whose father was still ill, the prize felt like a final hope. Without giving himself time to doubt, he decided that this competition could change everything. The moment he shared his decision, laughter echoed around him, as people whispered that a boy known for laziness could never defeat strong and disciplined competitors from across the kingdom. Their words stung, but Ryan ignored them, knowing that this time he could not afford to step back. He had 3 days to reach the palace, so he packed lightly and left early, walking with determination even though his body was not used to such effort. His parents watched him go with mixed feelings, unsure whether he would succeed, yet secretly hoping that this journey would force him to grow and break free from his old habits. After 3 long days of travel, Ryan finally reached the palace grounds, where contestants from many regions had gathered near a vast lake. As he looked around, his confidence began to shake, because most of the participants were tall, muscular, and clearly trained for physical challenges. Doubt crept into his mind, and he wondered how someone like him could ever compete with such strength. Soon, the rules of the first challenge were announced. The contestants had to cross the lake, and only the first 3 to reach the other side would move forward. As the countdown began, tension filled the air, and at the signal, nearly everyone jumped straight into the water, swimming with powerful strokes. Ryan stayed behind for a moment, watching them splash ahead. Knowing deep inside that he could never outrun them through strength alone, instead of panicking, he paused and allowed his mind to work, reminding himself that the goal was not to swim fast, but simply to cross the lake. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He rushed into the nearby forest, gathered broken branches, and quickly tied them together to form a small raft, using another piece of wood as a paddle. While others struggled and grew tired in the water, Ryan moved steadily across the lake, calm and focused. Slowly but surely, he passed many exhausted swimmers, and by the time he reached the shore, he had secured third place. Breathless yet amazed, Ryan realized something powerful in that moment. He might not be the strongest, but when he used his mind wisely, he could still stand among the winners. The next day arrived with an even heavier sense of pressure, as the remaining contestants gathered once more, knowing that the final challenge would decide everything. Ryan barely slept the night before, not because of fear alone, but because his thoughts kept returning to his family and the land he had left behind. When the competition began, each contestant was led to an open road where a massive wooden block awaited them, rough, heavy, and intimidating. The task sounded simple at first. Push the block 1 kilometer to the finish line, and the first person to arrive would be declared the winner. Behind the contestants lay several tools placed neatly on the ground, and they were told they could choose only one to help them complete the task. The first contestant, confident in his strength, immediately grabbed a thick rope and began pulling the block with all his might, his muscles straining as the crowd cheered him on. The second contestant chose a strong wooden pole, using it as a lever to slowly force the block forward, inch by painful inch. Ryan, however, stood still for a moment, carefully observing both the block and the tools. He knew that if he relied on physical power alone, he would lose without question. Instead of rushing, he reminded himself of the lesson he had already learned at the lake. This was not just a test of strength, but a test of thinking. As the crowd murmured impatiently, Ryan's eyes settled on a small knife lying among the tools. Without hesitation, he picked it up, causing confusion and laughter among the spectators, who could not imagine how such a simple object could help him move such a heavy block. Ignoring their reactions, Ryan knelt beside the block and began carving it carefully and steadily, his hands aching as minutes turned into an hour. Sweat dripped down his face. But he did not stop, driven by a determination he had never felt before. Slowly, the sharp edges of the block disappeared, and its shape transformed into a rough wooden sphere. When he finally stood up, the block was no longer something that needed to be dragged or forced. It could be rolled. While the other contestants continued struggling against weight and friction, Ryan placed his hands against the rounded surface and pushed forward. To everyone's surprise, the wooden ball began to move smoothly along the road. Step by step, Ryan gained speed, his earlier doubts fading with every roll forward. As he passed the other contestants, exhaustion burned through his body, but his heart felt stronger than ever. He thought of his father's tired face, his mother's silent prayers, and the fields that depended on him. With one final push fueled by hope and determination, Ryan crossed the finish line first, proving not only to the crowd, but to himself that true strength does not always come from muscles. It often comes from the courage to think differently and the will to change. As the crowd erupted into cheers, Ryan stood at the finish line, hardly believing what he had accomplished, his chest rising and falling as emotion washed over him. The same people who had once laughed at the idea of a lazy boy competing now watched in amazement, their disbelief slowly turning into respect. When the King's Guards announced Ryan as the winner and placed the chest of gold before him, it felt like more than a reward. It felt like a second chance. In that moment, Ryan did not see himself as a clever trickster or a lucky contestant. He saw a son who had finally found a way to protect his family. As he made the journey back to his village, his steps felt lighter, not because of the gold he carried, but because of the confidence growing inside him. When he reached home and told his parents everything, his father's eyes filled with tears, not from the wealth they had gained, but from the pride of seeing his son transformed. Ryan understood now that his laziness had never truly been about rest. It had been about avoiding effort and responsibility. Through hardship and necessity, he had learned that intelligence alone is not enough unless it is paired with purpose and action. From that day forward, Ryan approached his life differently, no longer searching for the easiest escape, but for the smartest and most meaningful way to work. He returned to the fields, this time not lying down or pulling ropes from a distance, but standing beside his father, applying both his mind and his energy to rebuild what they had lost. The villagers noticed the change and often spoke of his story as a lesson, reminding their children that cleverness without effort leads nowhere, but when guided by a strong reason, it can achieve the impossible. Ryan's journey showed that people labeled as lazy are not always incapable. Sometimes they simply lack a goal powerful enough to awaken their potential. His love for his family became that reason, pushing him beyond comfort and fear. And so, the story lives on as a reminder to anyone who feels unmotivated or underestimated that growth begins when excuses end. When you find a purpose bigger than your comfort, even the habits that once held you back can turn into strengths. And the person you thought you were may surprise you with who you can become. Thanks for watching. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. See you in the next one.